The year is 1948. Three Hopi elders climbed down from the mesas of northern Arizona and traveled to Washington, D.C. They carry no weapons, no army, no political power. They carry only a message, and they demand that someone in the United States government listen. What they deliver that day is a warning passed down for generations, a prophecy about a great gourd of ashes falling from the sky, about a day of purification, about a world that would lose its way. Nobody in that room takes them seriously. Within 2 years, the United States will detonate atomic weapons in the Nevada desert, less than 100 miles from Hopi land. Coincidence or something else? That question still haunts historians, tribal leaders, and conspiracy theorists alike. And it's only the beginning of one of the strangest, most overlooked stories in American history. Before we go further, if stories about forgotten history and hidden truths fascinate you, hit subscribe now, because this channel exists to dig up exactly these kinds of stories. To understand why that 1948 meeting mattered, you have to go back centuries to a people who built their entire civilization on top of the sky. The Hopi have lived on 3 rocky mesas in what is now northeastern Arizona for over 1,000 years, making Old Arabi, their principal village, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America. Historians and archaeologists confirm this much without dispute. The Hopi built their homes from stone and adobe, farmed corn in some of the harshest, driest land on the continent, and developed an intricate spiritual system built around ceremony, clan responsibility, and prophecy. Every mesa held its own villages, its own clans, and its own sacred shrines, each one tied to a story about how the people arrived and why they were chosen to protect this particular corner of the earth. And prophecy is where things get complicated for historians, because we are dealing with an oral tradition, not a written record. The Hopi believe their ancestors passed through several worlds before arriving in this one, the fourth world, and that elders were given warnings about how this world would eventually end if humanity strayed from a sacred path. These prophecies speak of a gourd of ashes that would fall from the sky and scorch the earth, of roads in the sky, of a house made of gourds that would circle the world, of a time when the earth itself would groan under exploitation. Some interpretations, popularized starting in the mid-20th century, connect these warnings directly to nuclear weapons, to space travel, and to environmental destruction. To outsiders hearing this for the first time, it can sound almost too precise to be coincidence, and that unease is exactly what has kept this story alive for generations. Now, here's where responsible telling of this story has to slow down. Historians and anthropologists are divided on how much of the modern Hopi prophecy narrative reflects ancient, unbroken tradition, and how much was shaped, reframed, or amplified during the 20th century, particularly after contact with non-Hopi spiritual seekers, journalists, and New Age writers in the 1950s through 1970s. Scholars like Armin Geertz, who spent years studying Hopi religious life, have pointed out that prophecy interpretation shifted over time, and that some of the most dramatic modern claims, the ones about atomic bombs and moon landings, took their most public shape only after those events had already happened or were already anticipated. This doesn't mean Hopi elders were lying. It means prophecy, like any oral tradition, is alive, reinterpreted generation to generation, and historians have to be careful not to flatten a living spiritual system into a tidy Hollywood plot. What is not in dispute is this. In August of 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Hopi elders, according to multiple documented accounts from missionaries and Indian agents stationed near the reservation at the time, reacted with something close to devastation, Not shock, but recognition. To them, this was a gourd of ashes made real. Whether that connection was made after the fact or had genuinely been spoken of before 1945 remains one of history's most debated spiritual claims. But the emotional weight of that reaction was real, and it set the stage for what came next. That brings us back to 1948, and then again to 1949. When Hopi leader Dan Kachongra and other elders petitioned the United Nations itself, asking the new international body to recognize Hopi sovereignty and to hear their warning about humanity's self-destruction. The letters exist. They are part of the documented historical record, and they were almost entirely ignored, filed away in bureaucratic offices thousands of miles from the mesas that inspired them. But the story doesn't end with prophecy. It collides head-on with something far more physical and far more provable: land. Because while the world debated whether an ancient people held secret knowledge of humanity's fate, the United States government was busy deciding what to do with the ground beneath their feet. In 1882, President Chester Arthur signed an executive order creating a Hopi reservation, but the boundaries were vague, overlapping with Navajo land, and this ambiguity would explode into one of the longest-running land disputes in American history, a conflict that dragged through courts for over a century and still isn't fully resolved. Black Mesa, sacred to the Hopi, sitting directly beneath their homeland, turned out to sit on top of one of the largest coal deposits in North America. Starting in the 1960s, the Peabody Coal Company began strip mining that mesa, using water from the same aquifer the Hopi depended on for drinking and farming. Elders who had warned about the earth being wounded by greed watched, almost in real time, as bulldozers carved into land they considered a living being, its coal veins pumped hundreds of miles away through a slurry pipeline that drained the aquifer even faster. This wasn't the only sacred site under siege. Across the American Southwest, ancestral lands considered spiritually essential by indigenous nations were being fenced off, mined, flooded, or restricted by federal agencies, often without meaningful consultation. The San Francisco Peaks, sacred to 13 tribes including the Hopi, became a ski resort. Blue Lake, sacred to the Taos Pueblo people, was seized by the federal government in 1906 and turned into national forest land, a wound that wasn't legally corrected until 1970, when Congress, in a rare reversal, returned the lake to Taos ownership. These stories, verified through federal records and congressional testimony, reveal a pattern that stretches across the 20th century, sacred land treated as resource, not as relationship. And that's the real tension at the heart of this documentary. Two entirely different worldviews colliding on the same soil. One that saw land as property to be surveyed, extracted, and monetized, and one that saw land as a covenant, a living participant in a prophecy about the fate of the entire human species. When Hopi elders spoke about a day of purification, they weren't describing a distant apocalypse detached from daily life. They were describing what they watched happening around them: water disappearing, sacred springs drying up, corn yields failing, ceremonies disrupted by mining schedules. By the 1970s, the story had caught fire in popular culture. Books, documentaries, and later internet forums seized on the most dramatic prophecy interpretations, sometimes stripping them of nuance, sometimes inventing details that had no basis in actual Hopi tradition at all. This created a strange paradox. The more famous the Hopi prophecy became worldwide, the more distorted and commercialized it grew, often without the consent or benefit of the Hopi people themselves. Some Hopi leaders have spoken out about this exact problem, frustrated that their spiritual heritage became a talking point for outsiders while their actual land and water rights remained unresolved in Washington. It's worth pausing here, and if you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten history, drop a comment letting us know what forgotten story we should uncover next. So what do we actually know, stripped of embellishment? We know the Hopi have occupied their mesas for over 1,000 years. We know their prophetic tradition speaks of catastrophic warnings tied to human behavior. We know elders formally petitioned the U.S. government and the United Nations and were dismissed. We know their sacred lands were mined, flooded, and restricted throughout the 20th century, verified by court records, congressional acts, and environmental studies. And we know that whether or not you believe prophecy can predict atomic weapons, the emotional and historical truth of a people trying to protect what they consider sacred while systematically losing the legal battle to do so is undeniably real. If this story moved you, if it made you question how history treats warnings it doesn't want to hear, then let us know in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because there are more forgotten histories like this one waiting to be told. The Hopi elders who walked into Washington in 1948 believed they were carrying a message meant to save the world, a warning they hoped might spare future generations from repeating the mistakes of the past. Whether or not the world was ready to listen, that question, more than any prophecy, might be the one still worth asking today.